All right, so we need to talk about this Derek Chauvin thing. And I know that a lot of you might not like what I'm about to say next, but he's actually innocent. If you're still with me after I said what I just said, then I appreciate you. And I would really love it if you were to hit the like button, subscribe, also make sure the notification bell is turned on so you're notified every time I upload a new video. So cops have this thing called qualified immunity, and what it basically means is that they can kill somebody in the line of duty as long as two things are true. One, as long as they're doing it in the line of duty while disposing of their duties or whatever it's called. And two, if they aren't aware that they're breaking clearly established federal law. But see, here's the problem with those laws and the police who have to know them. They don't know them, and they're muddy anyway. See, the way the law is written, if Derek Chauvin was to choke out George Floyd until he died on a sidewalk on a Sunday, then that was probably illegal if there was already case law that establishes that. But if the case law established that specific act, if he choked George Floyd out on the street with a knee, which is what he did until he died, that's not technically case law. While the manner of death was the same and it was the same type of situation, it doesn't make a difference because it's different. If what I just said sounded crazy to you, it's because it is. When I heard the family of George Floyd saying they wanted to get a first-degree murder charge, in my head, I'm like, that's not gonna happen, and I don't think they understand why it's not gonna happen. Before I get into the Floyd family, let me ask you guys a question. How often have you seen police officers charged and then the case gets dismissed before it ever goes to trial? Do you ever wonder why it doesn't go to trial? If you ever wonder why it never goes to trial, I'm here to tell you, it typically doesn't go to trial because the grand jury doesn't agree with the charges. And if the grand jury doesn't agree with the charges, it's probably because the person was overcharged. In order for there to be a first-degree murder conviction, the prosecutor would have to prove that Derek Chauvin left his house with the intention of killing someone, and that someone being George Floyd. It's almost impossible to really sit here and say what this man's intent was, even though we saw it on camera. What you see and what you can prove in court are two different things. So I hate to break it to you guys, but there's not gonna be a first-degree murder conviction. We would be lucky if there's even a second-degree murder conviction. Now, again, before I go further, I wanna make sure where I stand. I think you guys know where I stand if you saw my last video. I'll link it in the description or on one of the end cards. I think that Derek Chauvin intentionally killed George Floyd, but also dealing with the justice system myself, having my own personal run-ins with the law, I can tell you that truth doesn't matter. What we see doesn't matter. What matters is what can be proven in court. So did Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd? Yes. Did he do it intentionally? Yes. Will he still probably walk away even though the entire world see what he did? Yes. Yes, more than likely. Now, for a second-degree murder charge, it's still kind of difficult to secure, and I do know that his charges were upgraded from third degree to second degree, which could have been a mistake. And yeah, I know that a lot of people don't want to hear this, but we have to be honest with each other if we're going to manage our expectations for what to expect next and what to do after whatever it is we expect either comes to pass or doesn't. Regardless of what we saw on tape, you have to prove that even with reckless regard, he did have the intention to kill George Floyd. That was his intent from the very, very beginning. And again, that's hard to prove. Not to mention that in this country, juries are almost conditioned to believe police officers. If you ever listen to any stories where a police officer is going under the scrutiny of a grand jury, they usually decline to bring charges because people psychologically want to believe the cops are on the right side of the issue, when that's not really the case most times. Anybody with half a brain can see what happened on that camera on that day, but here's the issue. We still have to understand the prosecutor has to prove that Derek Chauvin was aware that by putting his knee into the neck of George Floyd, he would cause death. Now, if you're like me and spend every waking moment on World Star watching compilation fights, you've probably seen a few fights where somebody's choked out until they pass out. Derek Chauvin can easily say that he was trying to put enough pressure to make sure that George Floyd passed out. He wasn't trying to kill him. And there goes your second-degree murder conviction. When you add a biased jury and ambiguity in the law, this is a recipe for disaster. Moving on to third-degree murder, which actually only exists in 3 states, and Minnesota being one of them. Third-degree murder is pretty much voluntary manslaughter. And even with voluntary manslaughter, you have to prove that there was some sort of crime of passion, that something snapped in Derek Chauvin at that moment that made him kill George Floyd. and that's how you get a conviction for voluntary manslaughter. I don't see that happening. In my opinion, the appropriate charge is involuntary manslaughter. Not because I don't think it's murder, I do, but the reason that I think involuntary manslaughter is because, the law, the way the law is written, it's to help cops get out of these situations without having to go to jail, and in most cases without having to even go to trial. Involuntary manslaughter itself actually breaks down into two major tenets, and if they can prove one of the two of these tenets, if the prosecutor can, then there is a chance that Derek Chauvin will go to jail, but it's not going to be for life, unfortunately. With constructive manslaughter, you have to prove mens rea, that Derek Chauvin had the knowledge that what he was doing was going to cause the death of someone. Again, you can't really speak to someone's mindset, even if we could see it clearly on camera what he was doing. Exploring constructive manslaughter is also where we see our good old friend qualified immunity. If Derek Chauvin, a police officer, is responding to a 911 call, and in the middle of doing his job, he detains someone and accidentally kills them, guess what? He was doing his job. So most grand juries will decline to indict because qualified immunity. When discussing involuntary manslaughter and the two main factors, you next have criminally negligent conduct, or criminally negligent manslaughter. Here is where social media and the riots and the protesting, all of it comes together and plays a major part. See, there's been so much backlash when it comes to Black Lives Matter and just the whole movement and racism, etc., etc. There's been so much progress that there's been sweeping changes, but it's still not enough. I don't know about you guys, but I'm tired of watching bad apples walk away after a grand jury decides they don't want to take the case. Now, there is some good news. On June 4th, there was actually a hearing in Denver where 3 federal judges unanimously decided not to offer immunity to 5 police officers that shot a 22-year-old black man while he was laying on the floor motionless. And of course they killed him. Judge Henry Floyd, no relation I'm assuming, actually said that if he were to offer immunity to these 5 cops, it would send a really, really bad message, and actually talked about the death of George Floyd, how it influenced his decision making. In his own words, offering immunity or absolute immunity to 5 police officers that are accused of killing an innocent 22-year-old man would send a very bad signal. So all isn't lost yet. We got to keep our foot on the gas, pedal to the metal. Now, there is a shield that is protecting all law enforcement officers, but it looks like that shield is finally cracking. And that's a good thing.